The truck lurched to a halt, dust rising in pale clouds against the endless prairie sky, and the men inside gripped the wooden benches, their knuckles white beneath layers of grime and exhaustion. They had been warned about America, told stories that turned their blood cold during those final chaotic weeks as the Reich crumbled around them. Some believed they would be worked to death in mines deep beneath the earth. Others whispered of execution squads waiting beyond the wire. Nearly all of them feared starvation, beatings, and the slow erasure of dignity that came with defeat. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Their uniforms, once bearing the insignia of the Wehrmacht, were now threadbare and stained. Buttons hung by threads, boots were held together with scraps of cloth. They were soldiers without weapons, men without a nation, prisoners without hope. The truck's tailgate dropped with a metallic clang, and for the first time since surrender, air that did not reek of sweat and fear rushed over them. One man, perhaps 32, his jaw sharp beneath weeks of stubble, his eyes carrying the hollow weight of too many retreats, stepped down first. He was tall, broad-shouldered despite the hunger that had carved his frame thinner, and he moved with the careful precision of someone expecting a blow. His name was Friedrich Steinhardt, a former factory supervisor from Essen who had been conscripted in 1943. He had survived the Eastern Front, the collapse of Army Group Center, and the long march into American captivity. He expected nothing from this place except prolonged suffering. Around him stretched a landscape so alien it might have been another planet. Flat, golden fields extended to horizons unbroken by rubble or craters. Wooden barracks stood in neat rows, their paint fresh, their angles precise. Guard towers rose against the sky, but there were no dogs straining at leashes, no screaming officers with whips. American soldiers in clean uniforms stood with rifles slung casually over shoulders, their postures relaxed, almost bored. The silence itself was unnatural. Friedrich braced himself for the first command, the first shove, the first insult. And then something happened that made no sense at all. An American sergeant, clipboard in hand, began calling names from a list. His pronunciation was terrible, mangling German surnames into grotesque syllables, but his tone was businesslike, almost polite. When Friedrich's name was called, he stepped forward, spine straight, expecting interrogation or assignment to labor that would break him. Instead, the sergeant handed him a thin booklet. "Work assignment," the sergeant said in broken German, pointing to the pages. "You read, you work, you get paid." Friedrich stared at the booklet as if it were written in hieroglyphics. The words made no sense. Paid. He turned the pages slowly, finding lists of jobs: construction, agriculture, kitchen duties, maintenance, and beside each, a number. 80 cents per day for general labor, $1.20 for skilled work. The print was clear, official, stamped with the seal of the United States War Department. His hands began to tremble. This had to be a trick, a cruel joke designed to humiliate them before the real punishment began. He looked up at the sergeant, searching for mockery in the man's face, but found only mild impatience. The sergeant waved him along, already calling the next name. Friedrich stumbled forward, the booklet clutched against his chest, his mind spinning. Behind him, other prisoners reacted with equal bewilderment. One man, a former schoolteacher named Klaus Richter, laughed bitterly, the sound sharp and broken. "They mock us," he hissed to the man beside him. "They give us papers to read before they take everything." But another prisoner, a young farmer named Otto Brenner, stared at the booklet with wide eyes. What if it's real? What if they mean it? The question hung in the air like smoke. They were herded into the camp, past gates that opened without ceremony, past guard posts where American soldiers barely glanced at them. The barracks they entered were simple but solid. Wooden bunks lined the walls, each with a thin mattress and a folded blanket. Sunlight streamed through windows fitted with screens to keep out insects. Buckets of water stood ready for washing. There was no stench of decay, no crush of bodies packed too tightly. It was sparse, institutional, but it was clean. Friedrich chose a lower bunk near the door, setting his few possessions, a dented canteen, a photograph of his wife and daughter, a stub of pencil on the wooden shelf beside it. He sat down slowly, testing the mattress. It gave slightly beneath his weight. Real straw, not just burlap stuffed with shavings. He closed his eyes, feeling the structure of his expectations crumbling like wet paper. That first evening, they were called to the mess hall. The building was long and low, with tables arranged in rows. The men shuffled in, wary, shoulders hunched, expecting thin gruel or moldy bread. Instead, they found trays stacked at one end, and American cooks in white aprons loudly food from steaming vats. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Friedrich took a tray, his stomach nodding with hunger and suspicion. The cook, a round-faced man with graying hair, slopped potatoes onto the tray, then added a piece of meat. Actual meat, not gristle or bone, but a portion of beef, gray-brown and swimming in gravy. A slice of bread followed, white and soft, still warm. Friedrich stared down at the food, his throat tightening. He remembered the last meal he had eaten in Germany, a watery soup with cabbage so old it reeked, shared among 12 men in a basement in Leipzig, while artillery pounded the streets above. He remembered watching children fight over potato peels in the ruins of Dresden. And here, in enemy hands, he was being served meat and bread as if it were a Tuesday in peacetime. He carried his tray to a table and sat. Around him, other prisoners did the same, their faces masks of confusion. No one spoke. They ate slowly, reverently, as if the food might vanish if they moved too quickly. Friedrich chewed the beef, feeling the texture, the richness of fat and salt. His eyes stung with tears he refused to shed. Across the table, Klaus Richter shook his head slowly. "This is the softening," he muttered. "They feed us well before they break us." But Otto Brenner, the young farmer, was weeping openly, shoulders shaking. "I don't care," he whispered. "I don't care why. I just want to eat." Friedrich said nothing. He finished his meal in silence, every bite a small war between gratitude and shame. The next morning, they were woken at dawn by a bell, not by shouting or blows. They washed, dressed, and assembled in the yard, where the same sergeant from the day before stood with his clipboard. He divided them into groups, assigning each to different tasks. Friedrich found himself assigned to a construction crew, repairing fences and buildings within the camp. They were given tools, hammers, saws, nails, and shown to a section of fence that had rotted. An American corporal, a wiry man with sunburned skin, demonstrated what needed to be done, his gestures clear even though his German was non-existent. Then he stepped back and let them work. Friedrich lifted a hammer, feeling its weight, its balance. For a moment, he imagined swinging it not at a nail, but at the guard's skull. The thought came unbidden and left him cold. But the corporal simply stood nearby, smoking a cigarette, watching without tension, as if Friedrich and the others were contractors hired for a job, not prisoners to be guarded. They worked through the morning, the sun climbing hot and relentless over the Kansas plain. Sweat soaked through their shirts. Their hands, softened by weeks of inactivity, blistered. But there was something almost healing in the rhythm of labor, in the sound of hammers striking nails, and in the sight of a fence made straight and strong. At midday, a truck arrived with water and sandwiches. Sandwiches! Friedrich took one, unwrapping the wax paper carefully, and found thick slices of bread with cheese and ham. He ate standing in the shade of a half-repaired building, staring out at the endless prairie, and felt the world tilt. "Why?" Klaus Richter asked aloud, voicing the question they all carried. "Why did they treat us this way?" No one had an answer. The days began to follow a pattern. Wake, work, eat, sleep. The labor was real, not make work designed to humiliate, but actual construction and repair that served a purpose. Friedrich found himself falling into the rhythm of it, his body remembering the skills he had used before the war in the factory, the precision, the focus. And then, at the end of the first week, the sergeant appeared again with a metal box. He called names, and one by one the prisoners stepped forward. When Friedrich's name was called, the sergeant counted out coins and paper bills into his hand. He stared down at the money. $5.60. Exact payment for 7 days of labor at 80 cents per day. The coins were cool and solid in his palm. American currency. Real money. His breath caught in his chest. This was not scrip, not camp tokens that held no value beyond the wire. This was legal tender, money that could buy things, that held weight in the world. He looked up at the sergeant, searching again for cruelty or mockery, but the man simply moved on to the next name. Friedrich walked back to his barracks in a daze, the clutch in his fist. He sat on his bunk and spread the coins and bills on the blanket before him. A $5 bill, crisp and green. 3 quarters, a dime, a nickel. He touched each one, tracing the faces stamped into metal, the intricate designs on the paper. Otto Brenner sat across from him, staring at his own payment with tears streaming down his face. "My God," he whispered, "they paid us. They actually paid us." But Klaus Richter, however, threw his money onto his bunk with disgust. "It means nothing," he spat. "What good is money behind wire? They give us coins so we feel human before they take everything else." But Friedrich could not shake the weight of those coins. In Germany, he had not been paid in months. The factory had closed, the currency had collapsed, and food had been distributed by ration cards that were often worthless. His wife and daughter had survived by trading possessions for bread. And here, as a prisoner of war, he was receiving a wage. That night, he lay awake, staring at the wooden ceiling, listening to the sounds of men breathing around him. Some snored, others wept quietly. Friedrich clutched the $5 bill in his hand, feeling its texture, and tried to reconcile the image of the enemy he had been taught to fear with the reality of being paid for honest work. A canteen had been established in the camp, a small building where prisoners could purchase items, cigarettes, soap, writing paper, chocolate. Friedrich assumed it was another illusion, but when he entered the next day, he found shelves stocked with goods. An American soldier stood behind a counter, bored, reading a magazine. Friedrich approached, holding out his $5 bill. "Cigarettes," he said in halting English, a word he had learned from other prisoners. The soldier nodded, took the bill, and handed him a pack of Lucky Strikes along with change. Friedrich stared at the cigarettes, then at the coins in his hand. The transaction had been simple, transactional, normal. He felt dizzy with the absurdity of it. Outside, he opened the pack and lit a cigarette, inhaling deeply. The tobacco was rich, smooth, nothing like the harsh substitutes they had smoked in Germany. He sat on a bench, smoking slowly, watching other prisoners move through the yard. Some played cards, others tossed a ball back and forth. American guards stood at their posts, but they did not shout or threaten. They simply watched, expressions neutral. Friedrich thought of the propaganda he had heard throughout the war. The Americans were savages, he had been told, barbarians who would torture prisoners, who respected no rules, who delighted in cruelty. He had believed it because everyone around him had believed it, because the officers had repeated it, because the newspapers had screamed it. But here he sat, smoking American cigarettes, purchased with American wages, and the only cruelty he felt was the cruelty of his own confusion. Over the following weeks, the pattern continued. Work, payment, the slow accumulation of small comforts. Friedrich saved most of his money, hiding it in a tin beneath his bunk, but he allowed himself occasional purchases. A bar of soap that smelled like pine, a writing tablet and envelopes so he could send letters home, though he did not yet know if they would be delivered. One evening, an announcement was made. There would be a movie shown in the mess hall. The men gathered, curious and skeptical. A projector was set up, and a white sheet hung on the wall. The lights dimmed, and the film began. It was a Hollywood Western, dubbed poorly into German, full of gunfights and dusty frontier towns. The prisoners watched in stunned silence. Some laughed at the exaggerated heroics. Others stared, transfixed. Friedrich found himself caught up in the story, forgetting for moments at a time that he was a prisoner of war. When the film ended, the lights came up and the men filed out quietly. Friedrich walked back to his barracks feeling as though he had been allowed to glimpse another world, one where entertainment existed, where stories were told not to propagandize, but simply to distract. "They are trying to make us soft," Klaus muttered as they walked. "They feed us, pay us, show us movies. They want us to forget who we are." Or, maybe, Otto said quietly, "they are showing us who they are." Friedrich said nothing, but Otto's words echoed in his mind. The work continued. Friedrich was moved to a carpentry detail, building furniture for the expanding camp. He found satisfaction in the work, in seeing raw lumber transformed into tables and benches. His hands, once soft from weeks of captivity, grew calloused again. His body, though still lean, regained some of its strength. And every week, the sergeant came with the metal box, and every week, Friedrich received his wages. The pile of money in the tin beneath his bunk grew. He began to dream, cautiously, of what he might do with it. Send it home, perhaps, if that were allowed. Buy goods to trade. Save it for the day he returned to Germany, whenever that might be. One afternoon, as he sanded the edge of a table, an American officer approached. The man was older, perhaps 50, with graying hair and a weathered face. He spoke in careful, accented German. "You do good work," the officer said, nodding at the table. Friedrich straightened, unsure how to respond. "Thank you, sir." "You were a carpenter before the war." "Factory supervisor, but I worked with my hands." The officer nodded. "We need more skilled workers. If you are interested, we can move you to a detail building housing for incoming prisoners. The pay is higher, $1.20 per day." Friedrich stared at the officer, searching for the trap. "Why?" he finally asked. "Why do you pay us?" The officer considered the question, then shrugged. "Geneva Convention requires it, but also we believe in fair labor. You work, you earn. Simple as that." "Even for enemies?" "The war is over," the officer said quietly. "You are not enemies anymore. You are prisoners, yes, but you are also men. Treat a man like an animal, he becomes one. Treat him with dignity. He remembers he is human." The officer walked away, leaving Friedrich standing with the sanded table before him. The words settled over him like ash. That night, Friedrich wrote his first letter home. He used the writing paper he had purchased, his handwriting slow and careful. He wrote to his wife, Greta, telling her he was alive, that he was safe, that he was being treated well. He did not mention the wages, afraid she wouldn't believe him, afraid it would sound like madness. But as he sealed the envelope, he tucked inside a single dollar bill. Let her see it, he thought. Let her hold the proof. Weeks became months, the routine of labor, payment, and the small comforts became normal, though the strangeness of it never fully faded. Friedrich watched other prisoners struggle with the same confusion he felt. Some, like Klaus, hardened further, refusing to accept kindness as anything but manipulation. Others, like Otto, softened, allowing themselves cautious hope.
Friedrich found himself somewhere in between, working hard, accepting his wages, but always waiting for the moment when the mask would slip, when the Americans would reveal their true cruelty. But that moment never came. Instead, new opportunities appeared. A library was established, stocked with books in German. A small orchestra formed, instruments provided by the camp administration. Prisoners could take classes, learning English or trade skills. There were sports leagues, chess tournaments, even a small garden where men could grow vegetables. Friedrich joined the English class, sitting on a bench with a dozen other men, stumbling through basic phrases under the patient instruction of an American teacher. "My name is Friedrich. I am from Germany. I am learning English." The words felt strange in his mouth, foreign and awkward, but he persisted. One day, as he practiced writing English sentences, he paused and looked around the classroom. Sunlight streamed through the windows. The teacher was explaining verb conjugations with exaggerated gestures. Other prisoners bent over their notebooks, concentrating. It could have been a school in any peaceful town, not a prisoner of war camp. Friedrich set down his pencil and pressed his palms against the wooden desk. His wages, now accumulated over months, amounted to nearly $60, hidden in the tin beneath his bunk. He had written 3 letters home, though he had received no replies yet. He had learned 50 English words. He had built tables, chairs, and bunks that housed other prisoners comfortably. He had expected to be broken. Instead, he was being rebuilt. But the confusion remained. Every wage, every meal, every small kindness chipped away at the propaganda he had been fed, leaving him unmoored. If the enemy was not what he had been told, then what else had been a lie? If Americans could pay their prisoners fairly, feed them well, educate them freely, then what did that say about the regime he had served? The questions burned hotter than any physical hunger he had known. One evening, as autumn began to cool the Kansas plains, Friedrich stood at the fence, looking out at the endless fields. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. In the distance, he could see American farmhouses, smoke rising from chimneys, lights beginning to glow in windows. He thought of his home in Essen, now reduced to rubble. He thought of his wife and daughter, alive or dead, he did not know. He thought of the factory where he had worked, the orders he had followed, the propaganda he had believed. And he thought of the money in his pocket, the wages he had earned, the proof that even in defeat, even in captivity, he still held value. Behind him, the bell rang, calling the prisoners to the mess hall for supper. Friedrich turned from the fence and walked slowly across the yard. His boots crunched on gravel. The air smelled of coming rain. Around him, other men moved toward the light and warmth of the mess hall, their faces weary but no longer starved, their bodies bent but not broken. Friedrich entered the building and took his place in line, accepting his tray, his food, his portion of normalcy in a world gone mad. He sat at a table with Otto and several others, and they ate in companionable silence. "I received a letter today," Otto said quietly, pulling a thin envelope from his pocket. "From my mother. She is alive." The man around a table leaned in, murmuring congratulations. Otto's hands shook as he held the letter. "She says the village is destroyed, but the Americans came through. They gave food, medicine." His voice broke. "She says she saved her life." Friedrich felt his chest tighten. The enemy had not only paid him wages and fed him well, they had also saved his comrades' families. The contradiction was unbearable. Klaus, sitting across the table, shook his head. "Propaganda. He make us weak." But his voice lacked conviction. Friedrich lay in his bunk that night, the sounds of sleeping men around him. He pulled the tin from under his mattress and counted his money again. $63.40, a fortune in a ruined world. He thought of what the American officer had said. Treat a man like an animal, he becomes one. Treat him with dignity, he remembers he is human. He replaced the tin, lay back, and stared at the ceiling. The wages had been more than payment. They had been a message, a philosophy made tangible. and though he could not yet admit it fully, though the weight of guilt and confusion still pressed against his chest, Friedrich Steinhardt understood that something fundamental had shifted inside him. The war he had entered was over, but the war within him, the battle between the man he had been and the man he was becoming, had only just begun. The gates of Camp Concordia had opened with the same methodical efficiency that had governed every aspect of Friedrich's captivity. No fanfare, no speeches, just processed paperwork and travel documents handed through a window. He had walked out carrying a duffel bag containing his few possessions, $78.16 in American currency sewn into the lining, and a letter of discharge stamped with official seals he still could not fully comprehend. The ship that carried them across the Atlantic was crowded with returning prisoners, men who had spent months or years in camps scattered across the American heartland. They stood along the railings, watching the gray waters churn, their faces reflecting neither joy nor sorrow, only a numb anticipation of whatever awaited them on the other side.
Friedrich kept to himself during the crossing, his hand occasionally reaching to touch the hidden money through the fabric of his bag. $78, nearly 2 years of wages, saved carefully, spent sparingly. In America, it had bought him cigarettes, soap, writing paper, small comforts that had made captivity bearable. In Germany, he had no idea what it might buy, or if it would be worth anything at all. The men around him spoke in hushed tones, trading rumors about what they would find. Some had received letters telling them their families had survived. Others knew only that their cities had been bombed into oblivion. A few had heard nothing at all and traveled toward an uncertain homecoming with dread knotted in their chests. Otto Brenner stood beside Friedrich one evening as the sun set over the Atlantic, painting the water in shades of copper and ash. The young farmer had aged during captivity, though paradoxically he looked healthier than when they had arrived. His cheeks had filled out, his eyes had lost some of their hunted quality. "Do you think they'll understand?" Otto asked quietly. "About the camp, about the work?" Friedrich did not answer immediately. He thought of the workshops where they had built furniture, the fields where they had harvested crops, the wages counted into their palms every week. "No, I don't think they will." Otto nodded slowly. "My mother wrote that people in the village are starving, that children beg for scraps. How do I tell her I was paid to work, that I ate meat twice a day?" His voice cracked. "How do I tell her I was treated better as a prisoner than she was as a free woman?" Friedrich had no answer. The question had haunted him for months. When the ship docked at Bremerhaven, the men descended into chaos. The port was a skeleton of what it had once been. Cranes twisted into abstract sculptures of defeat. Warehouses gutted by fire, their walls standing like tombstones. People swarmed the docks, faces gaunt, eyes desperate, searching for loved ones or opportunity or simply something to steal. Friedrich stepped onto German soil and felt the ground shift beneath him, though the dock was solid. This was home, but it was not home. The air smelled of salt and rot and coal smoke. Voices rose in a cacophony of dialects and desperation. Children with hollowed cheeks and enormous eyes darted between the crowds, their clothes hanging from their frames like burial shrouds. He clutched his duffel bag tighter and moved through the crowd, searching for the processing center, where he would receive his final discharge papers and, theoretically, transportation assistance to his hometown. The line stretched for hundreds of yards, men shuffling forward with the patience of those who had waited in many lines and knew that hurrying changed nothing. When he finally reached the desk, a tired official barely glanced at his papers before stamping them and pointing toward a board listing train departures. "Essen line is not running. You'll need to go through Dusseldorf. Maybe, if the tracks are repaired." Friedrich stared at the man. "When?"
The official shrugged. Could be today, could be next week. Check the board. And that was it. Friedrich was free. Free to wait indefinitely for a train that might never come. Free to return to a city that might no longer exist. Free to search for a family that might be dead. He clutched his duffel bag tighter and moved through the crowd, searching for the processing center, where he would receive his final discharge papers and, theoretically, transportation assistance to his hometown. The line stretched for hundreds of yards, men shuffling forward with the patience of those who had waited in many lines and knew that hurrying changed nothing.
When the train finally reached Dusseldorf, Friedrich disembarked into a city that looked like the surface of the moon. Entire neighborhoods had been erased, rubble stretched for blocks, brick and concrete ground into powder, twisted metal jutting at angles that defied physics. People moved through the destruction like ghosts, their faces blank, their movements mechanical. He asked directions to Essen and was told the road was passable on foot, maybe 15 kilometers, maybe more depending on detours. No trains were running. Friedrich adjusted his duffel bag and began walking. The road was crowded with others traveling in both directions, refugees searching for lost family, black marketeers hauling goods, Allied soldiers in jeeps that roared past without slowing. Friedrich walked steadily, his boots, American boots, issued at the camp, solid and comfortable against the broken pavement. He passed through villages where children sat listlessly in doorways, their eyes tracking him with predatory calculation. He passed checkpoints where British soldiers inspected papers with bored efficiency. He passed improvised markets where people traded cigarettes for bread, watches for potatoes, dignity for survival. When he finally reached the outskirts of Essen, he stopped and stared. The city he had known, the city of factories and tidy neighborhoods, of streetcars and busy corners, was gone. In its place stood a landscape of destruction so complete it looked deliberate, as if God himself had taken an eraser to the earth. His hands began to shake. He had known intellectually that Essen had been bombed, that the factories had been primary targets, but knowing and seeing were different continents. He made his way through streets he barely recognized, navigating by the positions of ruined landmarks rather than by the streets themselves. The church where he had been married still had one wall standing, its stained glass long since shattered. The bakery where his daughter had loved to press her nose against the window was a crater. When he reached the neighborhood where his apartment building had stood, he found only rubble. The entire block had been flattened, reduced to a wasteland of brick fragments and twisted pipes. He stood at what he thought might have been his street corner and slowly turned in a circle, searching for anything familiar. Nothing. A voice called out from behind him, "You looking for someone?" Friedrich turned to see an old man, his face seamed with dirt and age, leaning on a cane fashioned from a piece of pipe. "Steinhardt family. Friedrich Steinhardt. My wife, Greta. My daughter, Anna." The old man studied him for a long moment. "You just get back?" "Yes, from America. I was a prisoner." The man's expression hardened slightly, something Friedrich could not quite read. "America, eh? Well, you look better fed than most of us." He spat into the rubble. "Greta Steinhardt took your daughter and went east, to her sister in Magdeburg. That was 18 months ago, maybe 20? I don't know if they made it." Friedrich felt his chest constrict. Magdeburg was in the Soviet zone now. Getting there would be nearly impossible. "Thank you," he managed. The old man nodded and shuffled away, leaving Friedrich alone in the ruins of his former life. He found shelter that night in the basement of a partially collapsed building, sharing space with a dozen other displaced people. They huddled around a small fire built from scraps of wood, faces illuminated in flickering orange light. No one spoke much. They had all lost too much for small talk. Friedrich pulled his duffel bag close and felt the hidden money through the fabric. $78. In this room, surrounded by people wearing rags, eating crusts of moldy bread,
His American wages felt like an obscenity. A woman across the fire noticed him and leaned forward. "You have food?" she asked bluntly. Friedrich shook his head. "No." "You have anything to trade?" He hesitated, then pulled a pack of American cigarettes from his pocket, one of the 3 he had brought with him. He held it out. The woman's eyes lit up. She crossed the space quickly and took the pack with trembling hands. "What do you want for it?" she asked, already calculating what she could trade it for on the black market. "Nothing," Friedrich said. "Take it." The woman stared at him as if he had spoken a foreign language. Finally, she tucked the pack into her coat and retreated to her corner without another word. But Friedrich felt the weight of every eye in that basement, measuring him, wondering what else he might have. The next morning, he began the process of navigating bureaucracy in a destroyed nation. He needed permission to travel to the Soviet zone, needed documents, needed connections. He spent days moving between offices that existed in makeshift buildings or tents, waiting in lines, repeating his story to indifferent officials. At one office, a clerk looked at his discharge papers and frowned. "You were in America for 2 years?" "Yes." "Doing what?" "Carpentry, construction. I was paid wages." The clerk's expression shifted, something between disbelief and resentment. "Paid?" "Yes." "How much?" Friedrich hesitated. 80 cents a day. Later, $1.20. The clerk stared at him and laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. "My brother died at Stalingrad. My mother starved to death last winter, and you were paid to build furniture in America." He stamped Friedrich's papers harder than necessary and shoved them across the desk. "Get out." Friedrich took his papers and left, the clerk's words following him like smoke.
He began to understand that his experience in Camp Concordia was not just unusual, but impossible to explain. When he mentioned it to others, searching for shared understanding, he was met with suspicion or outright hostility. One man accused him of collaboration. Another asked what he had done to deserve such treatment. A woman spat at his feet and called him a traitor. Friedrich stopped talking about the camp. He stopped mentioning the wages, the food, the education. He carried the truth inside him like shrapnel, painful and impossible to remove. He found work on a reconstruction crew, clearing rubble by hand for rations and a small stipend in the new Reichsmark currency. The work was backbreaking, hauling broken bricks into piles, digging through debris, searching for anything salvageable. His hands, which had grown calloused building furniture in Kansas, now bled from the sharp edges of shattered concrete. The crew was made up of men and women, all desperate, all exhausted. They worked in silence, saving their energy for survival. During breaks, they sat on piles of rubble and ate whatever they had to bring, usually bread so hard it had to be soaked in water, sometimes a potato, rarely meat. Friedrich shared his food when he could, using his hidden American money to purchase extra rations on the black market. He did it quietly, slipping bread into the hands of those who looked most desperate, but even this small generosity bred resentment. One afternoon, a man named Werner confronted him. "Where do you get it?" he demanded, gesturing to the food Friedrich had just distributed. "How do you have so much?" Friedrich did not answer immediately. Werner was skeletal, his eyes sunken, his clothes hanging from his frame. He had lost his entire family in the firebombing of Hamburg and survived only by eating rats and drinking rainwater. "I saved money," Friedrich said carefully, "in the camp." "Saved money," Werner repeated, his voice rising, "in the camp. While we starved here, you saved money in an American prison camp?" The other workers stopped and turned to watch. Friedrich felt their eyes on him, weighing, judging. "Yes," he said quietly. Werner laughed, the sound jagged.
You know what we call people like you? Army lovers. Traitors. You ate their food, took their money, probably believed their lies. He stepped closer. My wife died with her children in her arms because there was no food, and you were saving money. Friedrich said nothing. What could he say? That he had not chosen captivity? That he had been as surprised as anyone by the treatment he received? That survival was not betrayal? None of it would matter. Werner's pain was too great, too raw. "I'm sorry," Friedrich finally said, and he meant it, though the words felt inadequate. Werner spat at his feet and walked away. The other workers returned to their labor, but Friedrich felt the shift. He was marked now, separate, suspect. That night, alone in the basement shelter, Friedrich pulled out his notebook, the same one he had used to practice English in the camp. He opened it to a blank page and stared at the empty lines. He wanted to write to Greta, to tell her he was alive, that he was searching for her, that he had money saved that might help them start over. But he did not know if she was alive. He did not know if letters could reach the Soviet zone. He did not know if she would even want to hear from him. Instead, he wrote in English, the language he had learned in captivity, the language that separated him from the people around him. "I am Friedrich Steinhardt. I was paid for my work. I do not know if that was mercy or strategy. I do not know if I should be grateful or ashamed. I am alive, but I am not free. The war ended, but the battle inside me continues." He closed the notebook and pressed it against his chest, feeling the weight of words that would never be read. Weeks passed. Friedrich continued working, continued navigating the labyrinth of bureaucracy, trying to get permission to enter the Soviet zone. He learned to hide his American money more carefully, to spend it only in small amounts, to never mention the camp. He found a room in a partially repaired building, sharing it with 3 other men. They slept on pallets made from salvaged wood and blankets that smelled of mildew. At night, they lay in the dark and listened to rats scurrying through the walls, and sometimes one of them would talk about the past, about families lost, about cities that no longer existed, about the future they could not imagine. Friedrich rarely spoke during these conversations, but he listened. He heard the bitterness, the anger, the desperate hope that things might somehow improve, and he felt the gulf between his experience and theirs widening. One evening, one of my roommates, a former school teacher named Hans, asked Friedrich directly about the camp. What was it like? Really? Friedrich considered lying, but he was too tired. We were fed 3 meals a day. We worked and were paid wages. We had access to books, classes, movies. The guards did not beat us. The room fell silent. Hans stared at him in the dim light of a single candle. "That's not possible." "It happened." "Why?" "I don't know. They said it was the Geneva Convention. They said it was about treating us with dignity." Another roommate, Ernst, laughed bitterly. "Dignity? They firebombed our cities and then gave you dignity?"
The conversation ended, but the damage was done. The next morning, Friedrich found his duffel bag had been searched, his hidden money discovered, and stolen. He said nothing, did not accuse anyone, simply accepted the loss. Perhaps it was justice. Perhaps it was inevitable. He still had a few dollars left, hidden in the lining of his coat, but he stopped spending it. He ate only his rations, worked until his body ached, and waited for permission that never seemed to come. Months passed. Spring arrived, bringing rain that turned the rubble into rivers of mud. Friedrich worked in the rain, hauling bricks, his American boots finally beginning to wear through. He received a letter, forwarded through multiple channels, from Otto Brenner. The young farmer had made it home to his village, had found his mother alive, had used his saved wages to buy seed, and was planting crops. "Come visit if you can," Otto wrote. "There is always work here, and we remember how to be kind." Friedrich folded the letter carefully and put it in his notebook. He did not know if he would ever be able to visit, but the invitation warmed him nonetheless. Finally, in late summer of 1947, he received permission to travel to Magdeburg. The process had taken months, required bribes he could barely afford, and came with restrictions and time limits. He packed his few possessions and began the journey east. The trip took days, traveling by foot, by occasional truck rides from sympathetic drivers, through checkpoints and across zones. When he finally reached Magdeburg, he found another city of ruins, another landscape of destruction. He located Greta's sister's address, or what remained of it, and found the building still partially standing. He climbed stairs that swayed under his weight and knocked on a door that hung crooked on its hinges. A woman opened it, thin and gray-haired, her face collapsing with recognition. "Friedrich." "Helga," he said to his sister-in-law. "Is Greta here? Is Anna?" Helga's face crumpled, and Friedrich felt his world tilt. "Greta died. Last winter. Pneumonia. There was no medicine. She reached out and gripped my arm. But Anna is alive. She's alive." Friedrich could not breathe. Joy and grief crashed together in his chest, leaving him hollow and full simultaneously. "Where is she?" Helga pulled him inside. In the corner of the small room, a girl sat on a pallet, thin and pale, her dark hair lank around her face. She looked up as Friedrich entered, and he saw Greta in the shape of her eyes, in the set of her jaw. "Anna," he said, his voice breaking. She stared at him, no recognition in her face. She had been 7 when he left for the war. She was 10 now, and he was a stranger. "This is your father," Helga said gently. Anna did not move, did not speak. Friedrich knelt slowly, keeping his distance, not wanting to frighten her. "I've been looking for you," he said, "for so long." "Mama said you were dead," she whispered. "I was a prisoner, in America, but I came back." "America?" She tested the word like it was foreign food. "Did they hurt you?" Friedrich thought of the wages, the food, the education. He thought of the guilt and confusion, the impossibility of explaining. "No," he said finally, "they didn't hurt me." Anna nodded slowly, accepting this without understanding it. Friedrich reached into his coat and pulled out the last of his American money, $11, folded carefully. He held it out to Helga. "For Anna, for food, for whatever she needs." Helga took the money with shaking hands, staring at the American bills as if they were artifacts from another planet. "Where did you get this?" "I was paid for my work." She looked at him with an expression she could not read, something between gratitude and accusation. "You were treated well." It was not a question. Friedrich nodded. "While Greta starved?" "Yes." The word hung between them, heavy as stone. Helga tucked the money away and turned to put water on to boil. Friedrich remained kneeling, watching his daughter, who watched him with eyes that held no love, only wary curiosity. He stayed in Magdeburg for 3 days, sleeping on the floor, helping Helga with chores, trying to connect with Anna. The girl remained distant, polite but cold, and Friedrich understood that too much had been lost. He had missed her childhood. Her mother had died while he ate meat in Kansas. The gulf between them could not be bridged by money or apologies. On the third day, he held his daughter one time, felt her small body stiffen in his arms, and promised he would return when he could. He did not know if it was a promise he could keep. The journey back to Essen was longer, harder. Friedrich felt older, heavier, as if the visit had added years to his frame. When he finally reached the city, he returned to his room, his work, his silent existence among people who did not understand and could not forgive what they saw as his privilege. He continued to work on the reconstruction crews. Autumn came, then winter. The cold was brutal, cutting through his worn coat, freezing his hands as he hauled rubble. He thought often of the warm barracks at Camp Concordia, the regular meals, the quiet order. The memory was both comfort and curse. One evening, he sat alone in his room, having come home to find his roommates had moved out without warning, leaving him in the empty space. He pulled out his notebook and wrote again in English.
I survived the war. I survived captivity. But I am not sure I will survive the peace. The Americans fed me, paid me, educated me. They showed me that enemies could be human. But here, among my own people, I am the enemy. I am marked by survival, by the wages I earned, by the food I ate while they starved. I cannot explain what happened to me because the words do not exist. I cannot be grateful without being a traitor. I cannot be ashamed without denying the truth. I am caught between two worlds, belonging to neither. He closed the notebook and stared at the cracked wall. Outside, the city groaned with the sounds of reconstruction, hammers and saws, engines and voices. Germany was being rebuilt, stone by stone, but Friedrich wondered if he could ever be rebuilt, if the pieces of the man he had been could be reassembled into something whole. The bacon had been only the beginning. The wages had been only the symptom. The real transformation had been in understanding that the world was more complex than the propaganda had allowed, that enemies could show mercy, that survival came at a cost more painful than death. Friedrich Steinhardt had been freed from the camp, but he remained imprisoned by knowledge, by memory, by the unbridgeable distance between what he had experienced and what he could share. He rose from his bed, pulled on his coat, and walked out into the cold evening. The streets of Essen stretched before him, broken and slowly healing. He walked without destination, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air, his boots crunching on frozen ground. Somewhere in the ruins, a child laughed. Somewhere, a radio played music. Somewhere, life continued. Friedrich walked until his legs ached, until the cold numbed his face, until exhaustion finally granted him something close to peace. Then he turned back toward his empty room, knowing that tomorrow he would wake, work, eat, sleep, and carry the weight of his impossible truth through another day. The war had ended, but for Friedrich Steinhardt and for thousands like him, the real battle, the battle for meaning and belonging and forgiveness, had only just begun. And in the darkness of his room, as sleep finally came, he dreamed of Kansas prairies, of wages counted into his palm, of a world where enemies had shown him dignity while his own people showed him only suspicion. The dream was both memory and ghost, both gift and curse. And when he woke, he would carry it with him again, as he would every day for the rest of his life. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.